I first met Peter in 1971 when I was a social worker in the working-class African-American neighborhoods of West Philadelphia, and he was starting work with fellow scientist Joe Iyer on the high incidence of hypertension-related deaths in the African-American communities. Peter became both a mentor and a friend, and we've enjoyed a 50-year conversation on the issues we're going to be talking about tonight. In addition to being a highly distinguished scientist, Dr. Sterling has also been a dedicated social activist throughout his career. As a 20-year-old Cornell student, he left his studies to head to Mississippi in the summer of 1961 as a freedom rider, where he was arrested and jailed. That experience shaped his life over the subsequent decades, and he has sought ways in his work in science to see how it might shed light on the impacts of racism on the African-American community here in the United States. Today, Peter is devoting his career to championing a radically new vision of health. His recently published book, What is Health? Allostasis and the Evolution of Human Design, is the culmination of years of reading and research and his effort to answer this question. We're delighted to have him with us this evening and over this next several days, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Sterling.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's on. Thank you, Ray. It's a great pleasure to be here on this campus where I've never been before, and to speak to a live audience. I've been speaking when the book came out in February 2020. I took a swing up the West Coast from UCLA all the way to Seattle and gave a bunch of talks. And as I was turning around to go back home, COVID hit, and that was that. So I have been doing Zoom talks, and in a way it's good. I can get out of bed and brush my teeth and give a talk to Amsterdam, so it's nice. But to be on an actual stage with a laser pointer again, this is really fun. My talk is, it shouldn't be that long. It should be maybe 30 minutes, and then I'm hoping that we can have a conversation. It's being slightly obscured by the Zoom material, but the point is that my day job for 40, 50 years was studying the fine scale neural circuits. I used the electron microscope and microelectrodes to study how fine circuits work in the brain, various parts of the brain, including the retina. And that led ultimately to this book, Principles of Neural Design. And the idea of this book was Simon Laughlin, who's a wonderful scientist in Cambridge, England. And the idea is that the brain is smarter than a supercomputer, but it uses 100,000-fold less energy in space. A supercomputer occupies a warehouse, and it draws 20 megawatts of electricity, like a nuclear power plant or something. And your brain fits potentially in a milk carton, and it draws about 15, 20 watts of power, which is equivalent to the light bulb in your refrigerator. Okay, so, and yet it's smarter. And so the question is, how can that be? And so we made a list of 10 principles of efficient design that we think sort of lie at the heart of this. And we don't know everything about how the brain works, but we're pretty sure that it follows these ideas. And of course, and the body, of course, must also be efficient, because the body uses 80% of our total energy. And so it has to be efficient. And to achieve this, the brain predicts what the body will need, and then it regulates physiology and behavior to meet these needs. So Joseph Iyer and I named this style of physiological regulation. We called it allostasis, stability through change. Are there medical students in this audience? I mean, pre-meds and someone in this audience? Yeah. Well, you hear about homeostasis, that is how to keep the body stable by keeping everything the same. This is how to keep the body stable by varying the needs, varying the what's available according to need. And recently we've updated the story, and this is a review of Allostasis that's published in Trends in Neurosciences, which is a fancy journal now. This has achieved a certain amount of respectability. So the new book, What is Health, which some of you have in your hands, I hope you'll read it. Especially I hope that pre-meds will read it, because I think it will assist you in, if you do go to medical school, in understanding a lot of the nonsense that you will be told. Okay, it asks sort of what does our species need for a healthy life, and can we achieve this with drugs? And then also, why, for example, did Homo sapiens invest? Why did our brain invest in circuits that can produce art, painting, music, and so on? It doesn't bring us any calories, of any food. So why did our brain evolution develop our brain to do this? So for that, maybe I might be qualified to comment on fine-scale neurocircuits, but what gives me the right or the authority to comment on art and music and so on? And my answer is that there was, as Ray mentioned, an interplay between my laboratory studies and my social activism. And so the book and this talk really reflect how I've lived my life. And so again, it's sort of the secret got out in the poster and Ray's comments, but this was my first scientific report at Cornell University in Ithaca, 1961, the end of May. And immediately upon submitting it, I left Ithaca to go to Mississippi. And the idea was to join the Freedom Rides. And many people, so it's 60 years has passed, 61 years now. And maybe people don't remember that at that point, black people were not able to travel on buses or trains and use public facilities, public restrooms, public places to eat. And so this was a concerted effort of several political groups to force the Kennedy administration to change federal law to forbid segregation in interstate travel. And so what happened was that they selected a small group of people, Christians and Jews, whites and Protestants, whites and blacks, and old and young, and men and women, to get on a Trailways bus and a Greyhound bus from Washington, D.C., and go to the South and test what would happen when they travel as an integrated group and went to use the restrooms and the public eating facilities. And it didn't go too badly until South Carolina, when John Lewis, who was later Representative Lewis, died last year, was badly beaten in South Carolina. But they got back on the bus, and they got to Alabama, and then one of the buses was attacked by a mob and set on fire, and when the people escaped from the bus, they had the hell beat out of them. Okay, and at that point, there was a massive call for people to come all over the country, converge by bus or train to Jackson, Mississippi, and fill the jails, and until the government would actually enforce these rules of the end segregation. So that was the idea.
How about you? Can you give me any of your?
Yeah, that's okay. That's me. On the train, 10 minutes outside, we went from New Orleans to Jackson, and this is just before we were arriving at Jackson. And there's a guy interviewing us. I didn't even remember this until at the 50th anniversary, PBS was doing a series, and they sent me this little clip and said, "Is this you?" And certainly, it is. So this is me.
How about you? Can you give me any of your feelings on why you want to take part in this?
Well, I want to help establish the right of all Americans to eat together and to travel together.
Why do you think it's your responsibility?
I think it's every American's responsibility. I only think that some are more conscious of their responsibilities than others.
Yeah. So if I had to say it again today, I don't think I could do any better. I'm sort of amazed that I was so succinct. 30 minutes later, we were processed, and this is my mugshot. It's also my headshot on my Twitter account, so follow me on Twitter. My concern for social justice, which I had sort of grown up with, I do, by the way, I have an article that I published last year on the 60th anniversary called Why I Joined the Freedom Rides. And it's something I can't get into now, but it was published in a journal of biology, a very good journal. And if anybody wants a PDF of it, I can send it out, or I can make it available to this community, and you can read it. So my concern persisted, and the next stage, I'm in the mid-1960s. I'm a graduate student at Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm studying actually the pathways from the brain, from the motor cortex and sensory cortex to the spinal cord and the brainstem. And at the same time, I was slipping away from my microscope to canvass door to door in an area called Central. It's right near the university, the poorest black ghetto in the city. And what I found was people, when I knocked on their door, would come to the door, shuffling, often, limping, paralyzed on one side, their face sagging on one side, their speech slurred. And I'd never seen this. I didn't understand it. And when I went back to the lab, I learned from my mentor what the cause was, is destruction of these very pathways, these corticospinal, cortical brainstem pathways, due to a stroke caused by chronic hypertension. So I remembered that my grandfather had lived in Central, in Cleveland, 2 generations before me, and he'd been a house painter, poor immigrant, and he also had been segregated in this community, and he also had suffered hypertension and an early stroke. So I began to think, well, maybe social hypertension has to do with some sort of social tension. And as I finished writing my thesis in Cleveland, the whole the community, Central and Huff, a related place, exploded into riots, and the National Guard was called out, and so on. So fast forward to my own laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. I'm working there, but I'm still now slipping away to the library to seek evidence for what is really the biological cause of hypertension. If it's social tension, how is this expressed through the brain? Must be to the rest of the body. And I was also devouring ethnographic studies to learn how other people live. And pretty soon, I was actually slipping away to visit some of these indigenous communities in Central America. And it was actually Ray that pointed out to me that this would be pretty accessible to do in Panama. So that was my first introduction to where we live now. And so we now, as I say, live in a rural community in the mountains of western Panama. And we have a small farm, and this is, we live in a community of subsistence farmers and indigenous agricultural workers. And this is my neighbors. They're milling our sugar cane. So this is what I learned. This is one of the things I learned is that people who live like this as horticulturalists or hunters and gatherers, their blood pressure is low, and it's steady with age. It doesn't rise with age. And this is an example of a Nobe family, indigenous family. They're waving to us as we walk by. This is 2 days' walk from the nearest market. And people who live like that have low pressures. And this is true also for similar groups in Southeast Asia, South America, and Africa. So, but in the US, blood pressure starts to rise when children enter school. This is age down here and systolic blood pressure, men and women, boys and girls. And you can see that it starts to rise around age 6. I think more recent data where children leave their families earlier and go to preschool and daycare, it rises earlier. So by graduation, 25% of the population have blood pressures that are already in the hypertensive range. So this reflects sustained physiological arousal. All of the body, the neural circuits that get us going and excited and alert are turned on, and when they're turned on over the long period of time, we get chronically high blood pressure. And the rise is steepest for African Americans, and the reason they're the most stressed, and the reason is that in the U.S. Black lives still don't matter. And so this is an example. What that says up there is that blood pressure responds to each change in mental state. And what shows here, this is time. This is 12 midnight. This is noon. And this is, this is noon, this is 12 midnight, and this is 12 the next day. So it's 24-hour record. And this is systolic pressure going up and down. This is diastolic pressure. And it's being recorded by a cannula, a tube in the artery of this one individual as he goes through his day. And what it shows is that every little, it's going up and down. You're told by your doctor you have a blood pressure, you have 120 over 80 or something like that. And, but of course, blood pressure is not something you have. It's something that's varying all over the place in response to what's going on in your environment and in your head. And so, so for example, here it's 3 in the afternoon. This individual is sitting in a lecture like you, but he's dozing off, and his pressure is going up here. It comes down, and then at this point, he's stuck with a pin. His neighbor sticks him with a pin, and the brain's alerted to danger, sends the pressure high, and then he looks around and he realizes it's a prank, and his pressure goes back down. And then there are these unidentified peaks and valleys, but this peak here is midnight, and he's sexually aroused, and the brain predicts that he's going to need, more higher pressure to participate in what's about to happen, and so after sex, his pressure comes down during sleep, way down, and then the next day he's getting ready to get his kids ready for school and go to work and so on, and the pressure, he's coping with his day, and the pressure goes up in a sustained way. And so this is allostasis. It's the brain recognizing the context, predicting need, and then adjusting the pressure to match and to provide just enough, just in time. That is why this is efficient. It avoids errors of having too little, too late. A day late and $1 short, we are protected from that by our brain. So the other thing I want to point out is this wide dynamic range. It goes very high, it goes very low, and it's exquisitely responsive. And health, I say, is really the core of health is responsiveness to what's going on outside and inside. So arteries adapt to the mean pressure. Okay, and so the example is this is the record we just showed you. The mean pressure there is about 100, and the arteries in a person like that would look something like this. This is a healthy arterial vessels with some muscle on the outside of the arteries to contract and pump the blood, but a big lumen that's open to allow the blood to flow. So what happens is that when you have hypertension, this is another individual with chronic hypertension, similar 24-hour recording, their blood pressure, it still goes up and down, but it doesn't go very far down. And so if the mean pressure is around 160, the arteries are really challenged, constantly challenged, and this is what they look like. The muscle hypertrophies, and it begins to occlude the lumen so that it's harder to pump blood through. And this is sort of like arterial muscle responds to this chronic exercise in a way, just the way our skeletal muscles respond to lifting weights. This is what the body does. It adapts to the mean condition. So all of the mechanisms that regulate blood pressure are controlled by the brain. Okay? When I came to Penn and I began to go to the library, I found all these articles and chapters that said it's the kidney controls the blood pressure because it pumps in salt water into the blood, our vascular system, and it increases the blood volume. So the kidney is the problem. But of course, the kidney is controlled by the brain. The kidney doesn't know how much our pressure, what we need, and the brain is what's monitoring this. So the brain controls the endocrine mechanisms of the kidney. It also controls the heart, its rate and strength of contraction by nerves, and the two things together, the blood volume and the way that it's being pumped through, set the cardiac output. And the cardiac output has to flow through our blood vessels, and the brain controls their resistance, their diameter. It opens them up, dilates them, shrinks them, and so on. And these three factors together, by Ohm's law, basically determine the pressure. So the brain also controls our appetite for salt, and this is a big topic in neuroscience right now. But it's entirely clear that you need, if you're going to if the kidney is going to pump in salt water and regulate the flow of salt water into your vascular system, you need a source of salt. And so the brain sends us, out to looking for salty foods. And one of the guys who studied this for many years, J.P. Henry, concluded at the end of his career, he says, psychosocial arousal induces salt appetite, making a society's salt consumption a measure of its social stress. So now, drugs can treat hypertension. They can affect all of these systems, but when the brain sets the pressure, the drug opposes it, the brain compensates. And so, for example, the first drug that many people are given when they have hypertension is a diuretic. It causes the kidney to shed salt water and thereby reduce blood volume. But then the brain compensates by increasing the heart rate and contractility. There's a very effective drug to block that. It's called a beta blocker, and it reduces the heart rate, prevents the heart from increasing its rate. And then, of course, the brain can compensate by increasing vascular resistance, and you can block that too. And then you've got three drugs taking control of this vascular system, preventing the brain from doing what it's supposed to do normally, and you can reduce the person's blood pressure. And this is only three drugs, and many, many more. So that's fine. You can control the pressure, but now you have a system where you can't respond to the new predictions. And I'm an old guy, and I walk with other old guys as companionship and exercise. And many of them are on some of these drugs, principally the beta blocker. And when we come to a hill, they can't increase their cardiac output because of this drug. So we have to slow down and stop, basically. So it's a problem. And the other problem is that all of these, each drug that you give has multiple effects throughout the body. And that's because the mechanisms that they affect are widely distributed. It's not a side effect. It's the way drugs work in the body. So but some of them are not so good. So for example, if you give a beta blocker, it affects neural mechanisms that control blood sugar, and it raises blood glucose. And if you have type 2 diabetes or anything bordering on type 2 diabetes, this is a bad thing. And so if that's what's happening and your blood sugar is raised by your beta blocker, well, the doctors have other drugs to lower your blood glucose. And so you end up with more drugs. And there's drugs upon drugs. And the thing is that the result is basically an ill patient who is precariously stabilized by polypharmacy, that is, bunches and bunches of drugs. And so that is what I want to say basically about our physiology and how it's approached by current so-called modern molecular pharmacological medicine. So now I want to switch to a different level of thinking, and I want to consider what are the core problems with U.S. health, and try to connect those to some aspects of our neural design, and then discuss what we need to do. So this is a graph. This is a case in Dayton, who Ray mentioned. They're at Princeton. Dayton is actually a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and they are the ones that coined this term, deaths of despair. And what they define deaths of despair are deaths from drug overdoses, alcohol, and suicide. And this is a graph of the U.S. deaths of despair against time starting basically 30 years ago now. And so this is for a specific groups of U.S. whites who were born in 1970 who are now middle-aged, early middle age. And what you see is that it started rising gradually, but now it's been rising steeply for quite a long time, for the last 20 years. And much of Europe has been coming down, but in no case is it rising steeply like this. So this curve, if it was only shown for white males with of this same age group with no education beyond high school, it would be fourfold steeper. Okay, and this amounts to a lot. This is 60% of the white males in the U.S. So people with the least education are really the ones who are suffering most profoundly from this, from these deaths of despair. And I mean, there's more data on the African Americans and Hispanic and so on, all groups, men and women. But this gives you an idea of what it looks like. They're all slightly different for different reasons. U.S. and UK and Canada are showing sort of a similar trend, but not as sharp. So this is another way to look at the problem. This is, again, age, and these are different birth cohorts. So this is my cohort born in 1940, and 35, 40, 45, the life wasn't so hard, and the deaths of despair drift upward, but not that strongly. But starting around 1950, 55, and so on, you can see that the steepness of this curve grows. And so, for example, these are the people born in 1970. They're now middle-aged. They cross this line of 100 deaths per 100,000 at about age 45. But if you look at 1980, people born in 1980 are crossing that same threshold, 100 deaths per 100,000, at about age 35. And if we plotted the younger cohorts now, they're growing even more steeply. Okay? And this is part of why the younger people are so disturbed, because they are suffering in ways that are driving this sort of behavior, either suicide or overdose and so on. So obesity at the same time is rising. This is from 1970, very steeply in the U.S., from what I call foods of despair. That is, stuff that people are eating to make themselves feel better. And it's sweet and greasy, and that's what's raising everybody's levels of obesity, which interacts, by the way, with hypertension. The two of them drive each other, and so the combination is a serious health issue. And at the same time, these are mass shootings, which I call murders of despair. They're people who are just at the far end of despair that just lose it and go wild. And this is a level of despair that gun control is not going to cure. Okay, so we have to come to grips with this despair. So what is it all about? So let's first consider our huge brain. Our brain is 3.5 times that of a chimpanzee, which is our closest surviving relative. And it grows, it's smaller at birth, and it grows slowly in childhood, because to grow your brain takes an enormous amount of energy. So 60% of an infant in childhood energy that they take in is to grow synapses and nerve fibers and so on, and the brain just expands, and the skull expands with it. So, and this, of course, this is one reason why we don't grow physically. Our body doesn't grow until adolescence, when the brain is sort of asymptoting in its growth rate, and now the body can redirect some of these resources to grow muscles and bones and stuff like that to add height. This graph, is there any way to put that thing in the bottom of the screen? No, I guess not. You would have done it. What this thing says at the top is that, oh, yeah, wonderful. Thank you. To grow this large brain really requires, it requires care from 2 adult generations. And here's why. If you, this is data on hunter-gatherer communities across all continents, collected by some really good anthropologists, very serious people. One of whom is Hilliard Kaplan, who's in New Mexico somewhere. And the point is that this is age from 0 to 80, and this is net caloric production. And what it shows is that from 0, from birth on till around nearly age 20, we're sucking, a child is sucking up calories being provided by the adults. And that's to grow the brain, and then gradually there's a period in which your body begins to grow, but it's really not until about age 20 when human growth is sufficient for young people, to begin to feed themselves, provide their own calories, and so traditionally this was provided by 2 adult generations, parents and grandparents. And if that weren't the case, if there was a nuclear family that had to provide for the growth of this immense caloric sink for a child, the spacing of family spacing would be too wide. You couldn't have a child every 2 years. It would have to be 6 or 7 years or something like that. And you really couldn't sustain a population. I mean, you would, if you lost that child after 5 years, then your population would crash. So this, to grow and sustain a population with our design, which is a very big brain, required two generations. And so what happens then at age 20, around age 20 in hunter-gatherer forager communities, the young people go off with the adults and learn how to find food in the forest or the desert or someplace, and how to sustain themselves. And this, I thought this was an extreme. I think this might be one of the most important graphs in understanding human organization and biology, because what it shows is that once you go into the forest and begin to learn to trade, the productivity of hunter-gatherers improves over the next 25 years. Okay? They get better and better at it. You're hunting and gathering is not something you learn in a day. It gets better and better, and then by age you peak around age 45 after 25 years of study, and then you can sort of hang on into beyond your 60s. You're still sort of taking care of yourself and contributing to the community, and so what that means is that for 200,000 years, since we emerged as a species, hunting and gathering were challenging careers. They required a lot of studying, a long study and practice, and I can't even remember what that says, but it doesn't matter. That lent meaning to our lives, basically. You had something to do, and of course, the people here who were contributing to the young people, those are the grandparents. Okay, people by 40, you would be a grandparent, 45. So a lot of this contribution to our younger population is from the grandparents. So the next point is that every brain is different, and brains specialize in order to conserve energy and space. And this is one of the principles of neural design that I wrote about with Simon Laughlin. And so this is a view of the left hemisphere. Every square millimeter is occupied by some specific circuit, and that does some specific job, and that's an efficient way to organize the brain. So we have about 200 specialized cortical circuits for vision, for language, for hearing, decisions, and so on. And when we reach this limit, of course, you can't expand the brain. So once it's filled the skull and stopped growing, you have maybe 200 circuits, but you can't add more circuits, and you can't add much else without removing some other things, which is why we forget stuff, to make room for new stuff. So when we reached this limit, there was still a way to improve our species' intelligence, which was to specialize across brains. Each of us gets some different set of circuits, and so each of us has a unique set, and of course, we have some innate talents because of these unique sets of circuits. And when you have a talent, a special circuit, you practice it because that is the most rewarding thing. That's something you learn quickly, and you don't struggle with so much, at least at first. And so what that does is to produce a community of experts: a hunter, a healer, a navigator, a musician, and so on. And so communal intelligence outcompetes a design where everybody is the same. And, that's great. It makes us awesome as a species. But it creates sort of costs and problems, and one is that there's mental distress. I mean, each person is strange in some way, different from everybody else, and it's sometimes hard to bear. The other thing is that it creates interpersonal conflicts, and two smart brains competing for something, can cause a lot of damage. But of course, to benefit from this design of communal intelligence, we have to cohere in some way, find ways to overcome this, and that is achieved by what people call sacred practice, and what I would define that as practices that words alone really can't express, and so that is why our brain invested in these costly circuits which go beyond collecting calories. And so, for example, with the emergence of our species, very quickly, we had artists, people. So this is a cave painting from Indonesia from 44,000 years ago. This animal that's depicted is accurately enough so that it's still living in Indonesia and it's identifiable. These paintings were done by skilled people in the community who had innate skills and practiced them. Then there was, of course, music as well. This is a flute found in a cave 40,000 years old. And of course, what doesn't show in the paleontological record is dance and poetry and telling stories and jokes and stuff like that. There's no evidence preserved of elaborate sexual practices, which is also part of relieving tensions. And so these things elicit intense emotions: awe, grief, joy, and laughter, and those release tensions and allow us to give us a shot, at least, at cohering. Right now, it looks pretty difficult, but I think under decent circumstances, this works. And so, after 200,000 years of this communal intelligence, we got a steam engine. And of course, the steam engine tremendously expanded industrial production, and that's what led immediately. So this is the introduction of the steam engine here, and this is CO2 in the atmosphere, and it just shot up, and it hasn't. We need to have it turn down now, and it hasn't happened yet. And that's the most urgent thing we have to do. So industry shrank the opportunities for the challenging activities that we were accustomed to as hunter-gatherers. So Adam Smith, who was the father of modern economics, a Scotsman, he was a friend of James Watt, who got credit for the steam engine. And here's what he said. He said, the man whose life is spent performing a few simple operations has no occasion to exert his understanding or exercise his invention, and he naturally loses the habit of doing this, and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. It's very clear, 1776. We were just writing out our Declaration of Independence, But I think it's not that we've become stupid. The problem is that we're still smart, but we've narrowed the possibilities to exercise our innate gifts, and so we evolved to explore the planet, and we did very early, very quickly. Leaving Africa, we got to Australia in only 10,000 years after leaving Africa. We had to build boats across the Pacific. I mean, it was really quite amazing. Cross the Bering, land bridge down all the way down to South America, very rapidly, and now multitudes of us are trapped to just punch a ticket, scan a barcode, do something like that, and jobs that are learned in minutes or days just don't present a sufficient challenge to these huge brains that we evolved. So, and I think it's this mismatch between our abilities and our opportunities to use them that causes despair. So, what links despair to compulsive consumption? We inherited a circuit that drives us to seek, and the circuit. So we're looking for some food, we're looking for some shelter, and the circuit rewards anytime you find something that was unpredicted, a surprise, a positive surprise. It rewards us with a little pulse of dopamine. This is what our brain does, and it was invented by a worm 500 million years ago, and we adopted it because it's so effective. So this is an example of a recording from a dopamine neuron, and this is the nerve cells firing away spikes, and when the reward is unpredicted, you get a big pulse of spikes, pulse of dopamine. So we experience this as a pulse of satisfaction, and we can take a deep breath and pause in our seeking, and as the pulse dissipates, we're driven to resume our seeking to serve the next need. So foragers find food unpredictably. They find a root or a rabbit, a berry, and they get a pulse of dopamine. They find a comfort unpredictably, a dry cave, a warm fire, after being cold and wet. That's wonderful. They get some dopamine and they can relax a bit. So they have frequent sources of these small rewards, but we find food and comfort predictably. You know where you're going to get your food in the supermarket. You know that you can switch on the thermostat when you walk in your house, without any effort or surprise. And the problem is, it's very convenient, but predicted rewards provide very little dopamine. And this is a recording from the same neuron. Okay, and when the reward is predicted, where's the dopamine? So, excuse me. So, lacking these frequent pulses, we grow restless and we look around for surprises. And where do we find them? Well, when food is predicted in the supermarket, the main surprise is more and richer. Okay, so so we get these great surges of sugar and fat, cause surges of dopamine. So, but the problem is that if the surprise is more, the next surprise, once you get used to more, the next surprise has to be even more. And so we're driven by this arrangement to go from a Mac to a Big Mac to a Whopper. And of course, this just stands for every other thing in our life, the size of a car, everything is driven by this this need for surprise. And this is something, of course, that capitalism is brilliant at exploiting. So the brain, of course, adapts to each of these surges by reducing its sensitivity. This is the way the brain works, is you change the level, you raise the level, the system adapts. So it's the same story for drugs. Alcohol, nicotine, cocaine, amphetamines, opioids, all act on the parts of the brain that release dopamine and respond to dopamine, and give us these surges of dopamine, and to which we adapt. So I want to make the point very strongly that when you read the literature, it talks about substance use disorder. It says addiction is a disease, it's a mental disorder. Alcoholism is a disease. This is wrong. This is just a misunderstanding of actually the way the brain works and physiology works. We have initial consumption of any of these drugs because it's a natural effort to escape our lack of these little small pulses. So we start on some drug or food or activity that will give us a good surge of dopamine. And then, of course, the escalating use, which is part of addiction, is just a natural adaptation of the neural circuits. So this is the way our retina works. If you're adapted to this level of light, and a great flash of light hits your retina, it turns down sensitivity. And this is the way the body works in every respect. So it's a real misunderstanding, and it's a sort of a denial, head in the sand sort of denial, to call these problems that we're facing, to call them individual disorders, something wrong with your brain. It's not true. Okay? So, So in summary, health, I think, is responsiveness, and it's adaptation to this continual change of just enough, just in time. And it involves predicting needs and minimizing errors, and that's why it's efficient. Allostasis is all the processes that support predictive change. And you learn in your classes about homeostasis, which is correcting errors. Well, we do have these mechanisms to correct errors, but that's because lots of things aren't predictable. And so if they're not predictable intrinsically, we're going to make errors, and we need those mechanisms to correct, but it's not the basis for organizing our physiology. The first cell, for example, a cyanobacterium in the ocean, evolved a molecular clock that could tell when the sun was going to shine and when it would be not shining, and that's the time to make DNA, when the UV from the sun is not going to destroy it. So this was a very important single cell prediction that we now have incorporated into our brain. The first brain of a worm predicted all the worm's needs and learned to find the resources to keep the worm going, and it used this dopamine circuit. So these molecular neural circuits were optimized by 500 million years ago. And now we're tweaking them. Modern medicine is all about tweaking these little problems with drugs to fix the problems that were created basically by the steam engine, and its later versions. Okay, so this doesn't make any sense. And as I've said, these drugs that block these old signaling mechanisms reduce responsiveness. This did not lead to health. So we treat despair, addiction, obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease at the molecular level with all these drugs sold by all of these big pharma companies. And I must say, I'm a scientist. Science has been brilliant in finding these molecules to do this, but it's not bringing us health. It's not even plausible, and it's very, very expensive. So if we weren't doing it this way, we wouldn't be worrying about how to pay for medical care. So I say finally that our brain evolved for individualized lives of physical, cognitive, emotional, and spiritual responsiveness, learning across the lifespan, and that's where we have to go. And so this last point is that what we need is a social inclusion. We need to have everybody feel that their lives matter, and we need to reduce inequality because that reduces stress and despair, improves health, and yeah. What's that? And it requires practicing our gifts across the lifespan. And we now face that automation is reducing job quality, but we don't need more jobs. We need challenging activities. And we have to keep that in mind. And we need to expand these sacred practices to relieve the tensions that are caused by our strangeness. And so now we can click for products of these sacred practices. We can get our music from Spotify, Netflix, SPN. We can get sex from Pornhub, all virtual, but vicarious experience is not going to substitute. It doesn't provide the dopamine we need, and it just escalates our unhappy search for it. But what we need to go is to rebuild our communities and find new forms of communal life and participation, basically. So that's it, basically, and I thank you.
So what we like to do now is just invite questions from all of you, and there are people online, I think, on Zoom, and we're welcome questions through the chat. Why don't you sit down here? Turn on my microphone is what I'm being included to do.
Okay.
There we go. So, yeah, Stella, do you want to lead off?
Sure. It was fascinating. My name is Stella Rivera, and I am a researcher at the Paul T. Institute. I am a demographer by profession. And
I don't want to say I have 3 questions because but I have 3 questions. They are kind of related. So when I was trying to put together the what I got as the teachings from your talk with the consequences for health inequality. And there's something that I don't completely understand, so I need help, you to help me square these things out. So I heard 2 things, among many others. The one, first, one of the things you're saying is that when we use medicine, we are restricting or limiting the body's ability to restore itself. And that leads me to think, if that were the case, couldn't it be that communities that have less access to medicine would then be healthier than communities that have more access? So there's something that sounds a little counterintuitive to me there. Mm-hmm. And that's also linked to another thing that you said in terms of, okay, so we have our needs satisfied, right?
Well, let's stop, because I can't remember them all, but I can respond to that. That's a very good question. Okay, so isn't it, aren't I saying that the poorer communities should have better health than the rich ones? Well, it's complicated, but in some cases it's true. I mean, for example, if you live in my community of people who are doing sustainable agriculture and don't have very much cash, they have communal activities. They have things that maybe you wouldn't approve of, like a cockfight. That was a big thing. The community comes and it's very exciting. People bet. They have dances. They have all kinds of communal activities. And I'll tell you, in a small community, there's a small elementary school. Kids go to town for high school. There's several little evangelical churches. There's a Catholic chapel not too far away. And religion is a very big thing. And if you say to somebody there, take good care of yourself, they say, sí, gracias a Dios. They always respond by saying, yes, thanks to God. And they mean it, It's not just throwing off. And so this is a community with a communal life. There are no police in this community. They don't patrol. Occasionally, I say, we've been there 18 years. I think maybe there was one Saturday night fight that somebody was killed, and so for a while there was some. But this is not a common thing. There's probably some thievery, but people know. It's sort of self-limiting. And there's no, and people, there's a few alcoholic men in the community who are, sort of known, but mainly people, they'll get a little high and drink, a beer or there used to be a chicha that people would make fermented, but there's no cocaine, there's no heroin, and there's not much marijuana because the law against it is pretty draconian. So in these sorts of communities, the people who raise the coca leaves are not cocaine addicts. They chew a little coca, the people. So in these communities, these drugs are used to get maybe a little high, but not, and sometimes they're used ceremonially as like ayahuasca, which you probably all know about. It's used to maybe have a vision, communal visions, but they're not used to substitute for a life. So right there, the drugs of abuse, the level is way low. The violence is way low. There's nobody sleeping on these streets. Somebody will take you in. There's if people are hungry, other people feed them. And so the level of social care is very high. Now there are certain medical issues that really do require high technical stuff. So one of the things that we found, my wife and I were maybe asked to provide some outside education, medical education. So we asked people, well, what do you want to hear about? Well, a nurse came from town and talked about diet, but what they really wanted was some first aid instruction. What do you do when you slash your leg with a machete, which is a common injury? There's not much, there's sometimes some snake bite issues, but not too much now. So, so people appreciated that sort of basic first aid stuff. So now, but they have, now, since we've been there, the road has been improved. Buses now serve the community. People used to walk 6 miles out to the main road. They don't do that anymore. They take the bus, and they get fast food, and their waistlines are increasing. And they, instead of hacking with a machete, cutting stuff, they have a weed whacker, and so the culture is changing, and their health is deteriorating. And so that's one aspect of it. Now, in the communities, poor communities in the U.S., which are beleaguered, which are decimated by amphetamines, and in the hills of Virginia, it's amphetamines and I guess fentanyl now, but it's all over. The medical care in the end, they're being decimated by foods of despair. The medical community that's really not treatable. I mean, people, so wherever you are, if you're getting treated for type 2 diabetes and hypertension and stuff like that, these drugs have been around for a long time for hypertension, and people don't take them, and so it's not controlled. So over many decades, these problems have gotten worse because medical care doesn't do it. Okay? And so maybe now, what's your next question? I mean, there's more to say on that, but
it was actually related to the inequality. So I didn't know if. Yeah. And I have to say, I have hypertension starting many years ago. So what you're saying actually makes sense about not being controlled.
Let me make one point about that. Is that although I'm not an ideologue against taking drugs to treat certain things. So if you have hypertension, there are things that the best things to do are to lose weight and to exercise a lot and to get sleep. Those are the most important things for health. I mean, the only way I can keep doing this, I'm 82, and this is my fourth talk for the day, right? I think, yes. So I do this because I walk and I exercise, and I try to keep track of how much intoxicants I take, not too many. If you have hypertension and it's not controlled by these measures, then you do have to take some drug. Hypertension is a lethal thing, so you have to keep your pressure down. So I'm not telling people don't treat your hypertension. No, treat it, but also treat it by living well, and then as you do that, you can maybe reduce the number and doses of the drugs. But very often, physicians will just hand out the drugs and say, you take this for life. Well, that's not necessarily so. You have to readapt those arteries, and it can take and the neural circuits that drive them. It can take a while. It's something you have to work at. Mm-hmm. So I'm not opposed ever to taking a drug.
Great. So my following question was also about inequalities, and at Polti we work in many countries, middle and low income countries, but in most of them, and in most of the communities that we work, even the most basic needs are kind of accessible. I mean, they are not isolated or like and so so the question is, the other thing you were saying is that the more you have, or the more that you have some of your needs satisfied, the more you're going to expect, right? And that again leads me to think, okay, but if that's the case, wouldn't it again be that richer people who have more are seeking and are seeking more artificial pleasure, and wouldn't that be the case that they would be the ones that are less healthy? And I don't think that, I mean, that's not happening either.
What's your question?
So how do we, well, let's say, how do we reconcile the fact that, or is there a way to reconcile the fact that we are living in societies that have many resources and have our basic needs accessible with the need for health and inequality? That's basically it. So because you're going, yeah. I mean, one of your conclusions was, if it's the fact that we have many of our needs solved that is driving us to unhealthy behaviors, right? How can we live with healthier behaviors?
Well, look,
having many of our needs solved.
I get it. So how can we overcome the fact that we have a relatively easy life? We being the people in this room with pretty high levels of income and education. Well, first of all, you know, Europe doesn't have this problem, okay, to the extent that we do. They're out there, they're exercising, they're doing stuff, they're engaged, and for many aspects of their social organization, they are engaged, and so they just have lower levels of all of these social problems than we do. So one thing I suggest is take a visit to Europe. It's very inspiring, actually, to see all of the public facilities they have, the way that they exercise, that they eat decent foods. They don't just live on Big Macs and Whoppers and so on. They have an interest in non-vicarious activity. So that's one thing I would say. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. Excuse me, my name's Marie Donahue, and I teach biosocial determinants of health. And boy, oh boy, does your material resonate. I do have to thank you for this book, because I'm working on, our next unit is going to be the opioid crisis, and I see a lot of material that I can add. Sure. What I want to say, in addition, I was going to ask about Europe, but I think another thing, when we think about health, it's obviously not just the physical. And what they have in Europe, I think, that supports health, they have health insurance. Virtually everybody's got health insurance. They have family leave. You know, women and men can split, I know in Germany, 9 months. Right. And that is absolutely crucial to optimizing health. Right. Right. So what do you think the best strategy for us in this country is, or I guess it would be strategies, to kind of move forward to that kind of model?
So I would say two things. One is that I'm delighted that you're teaching this course, and I make the offer, made it earlier today, if anybody is teaching a course and using this book as a text or as part of it, and you want to invite me to have a discussion at the end of the class or at the end of the book or something like that, I'm delighted to do it by Zoom. I can do it.
Consider it done.
Okay, so all you need is my email, and I'll give you a card afterwards. So, and my email, by the way, has a number of links to other essays that I've written. One of the articles that was published that Ray mentioned, that came out in February, is a critique of the National Academy of Sciences report on deaths of despair. The National Academy, this august bunch of scientists, published a report last year. I gave 2 talks on this morning. Are we doing all right? Or?
No, you're fine.
Yeah, go ahead. Saying, yes, death of despair rising, what should we do? Well, we need to teach resilience to individual people. We need to give them clean needles. We need to have rehab, better rehab. We have to have better availability of drugs to get them off the drugs they're on. This is all nonsense. It's all focused on SUD, substance use disorder. This is wrong. These are not disorders, and it's not going to be treated at that level. So what they don't, this report compares U.S. Rising death rates to 16 nations. It includes most of Western Europe, Japan, Canada, and Australia. And it doesn't ask, what are they doing? How come they don't have this problem? And so I wrote with a younger colleague, Michael Platt, a response that says the reason they don't have that problem is look at what they're doing. And as somebody started to mention, they have, or maybe you did, they have prenatal care, they have postnatal time off, they have vacations, paid vacations. The U.S. has no law that says you have to pay anybody for a vacation. So 25% of working people in this country have no vacation.
Paid sick time is another.
Yeah, all this stuff. So they have free medical care, they have cheap tuition, they have free school care, they have everything.
Labor unions.
Huh?
Labor unions.
Labor unions, yes, labor unions. So they have everything to give them a shot at sort of a reasonable way to live. And to do that is not a mystery. They have done it. All we have to do is sort of make our version of what they're doing all over the world. And President Biden had this slogan, "Build Back Better." It had a lot of this stuff in it. And there's one guy who's from the state that's the worst in the union, worst off people, and he's blocked it. So I think one of the things we have to do is we have to elect some more people to Congress, Senate, and House to keep these sons of bitches basically from making the country so much worse. And that means going out and political organizing and going out into my gosh, Indiana is not exactly a progressive place. It's my understanding. Is that right?
That's right.
So start organizing. That's what really we have to do in this country is to get people who want to solve. It's not that hard to solve the basic stuff. You just have to give people what they need. So sorry.
Hi, thanks for the lecture. That was really brilliant. I liked it a lot. I teach. I'm not in any policy field or biological sciences or anything like that. I'm in cultural studies, and I'm giving a couple courses on work this semester. A couple of my students are here, and I was wondering if you would elaborate a little bit more. You already intimated a lot on the relationships that you're seeing between deaths of despair and work. Both the left and the right sort of have their talking points on that topic. One puzzle that I sort of have thought about before, and I seem to notice it again in some of the charts that you showed, is we have this idea of overwork actually resulting in death, right? There's the famous word for it in Japanese, karoshi. And that seems to be related to hypertension and stuff like that. I would personally think of that as a death of despair, even if it doesn't involve drugs, to die from overwork. And then there's plenty of cases that are known about of death from essentially underwork, and the stress of a job that doesn't require a person to actually work, or the stress that comes without being able to find work. But then what about the relationship between deaths of despair and just simply meaningless work? And you've intimated a little bit in your graphs, and then this is where the puzzle comes in that I noticed, and maybe it's very simplistic. I'm looking at this stuff from a different angle. But one thing that I noticed is deaths of despair have really shot up, as you demonstrated and as has been talked about in the press, in recent decades. It's really shot up. But that image that you gave us of the life that's, 40 or more hours a week of it are consumed with a rote activity that doesn't give us any meaning, that is a couple hundred years old, and you could even, some anthropological archaeologists go as far back as like the origins of agriculture to talk about that sort of like, I don't know what, like repetitive work, death. So I guess what I'm wondering is, what is the relationship between work, in your findings, what is the relationship between work and deaths of despair in the specificity of these recent decades?
Okay, so that's a very good question, and thank you. There's a number of things to say. One is that this death of despair is getting some publicity now because it's become so extreme. I mean, over 100,000 deaths of overdose from opiates last year. But if you look at those cohorts that I showed, it was already starting in 1950. So it's been going on. I began writing about this with Joseph Iyer, who was an epidemiologist, biologist, and we published a paper in 1977 saying, basically stress-related mortality and stuff like that. So it was a problem back then, and we predicted actually that because it was going to get worse with these successive cohorts, that we would see this rising deaths of despair, and this is we predicted this in 1977 because the evidence of its beginning was there, and it's built into this population. In the meantime, this is the period, of course, where this immense flowering of biological and medical sciences in the U.S. Been a huge investment, great, brilliant successes. I've benefited from it in my own career, but it hasn't improved health. Okay, so I think we have to abandon that idea. In terms of work, it has gotten worse because so in the 19th century, before good old Henry Ford, people had cooperative work. It was hard work. I mean, if you walk along the B&O Canal, that was all dug by hand. There were machines to do that. I mean, men worked hard, and they were tired, but they did it together. And then what we got very early with in the 1900s were these time study guys, and a very important one. I think it's worth reading. Frederick Winslow Taylor. Yeah, I think that's what it is. He was one of the early efficiency experts, and he wrote a book and he testified to Congress how you improve the efficiency of work. Well, you take the biggest guy, you give him a shovel that's just matched to his physical thing, and he works, and you pay him extra on the side, and he shovels like crazy, and he sets a standard for the rest of the guys. They're going to meet it. So, and this was done in every industry. And how many people in this room actually have seen the Charlie Chaplin movie, Modern Times? Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a hilarious movie, and it's so moving, so poignant. It was made in 1936 at the height of the Depression, and you can get it on YouTube. You just click, put it on your laptop, and it's an amazing movie, and it's describing the dehumanization of the workforce by the assembly line, and that was in a period when the CIO unions, the auto workers union, and the mine workers, and the steel workers, and the longshoremen were organizing unions to defend themselves against this kind of stuff. So it hasn't always been this bad. It is just in the last century, it was part of the rise of capitalism, and the workers defended themselves, and now the unions have really sort of disappeared, and they need to come back and stop this. There are two books that I haven't read, okay, but I'm recommending them anyway. One, they're both by a man named David Graeber, who died very young last year. I can't remember why, but he wrote a book. He was sort of an anthropologist, ethnographer, and he got involved in the Wall Street movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement. And he wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs. And and I've read, bits and pieces of the summary of it. It's on my list, but I think it's probably worth reading. And he says, here's 4 kinds of jobs that are not necessary. We don't need them. They're hierarchical jobs. Imagine. I'm always struck by when you call some call center to something that says this call is monitored for quality purposes. They have to spy on people to make sure that they behave well. Imagine, because it's such an unpleasant job that you have to listen to these people screaming at you all day, and so, but that somebody will fire you if you don't say everything just right. So, we need to, if we weren't driven by this insane capitalist ethic that everybody has to work doing nonsense things, people could hunter-gatherers spend a lot of time sitting around the campfire, talking, telling stories, schmoozing. They weren't working that hard, and they didn't accumulate lots of stuff because they knew the stuff was out there, and maybe if they didn't find it today, they'd find it tomorrow. So the whole level of intensity of work has intensified under capitalism, and my friend Joe Iyer actually published a paper where he analyzed the business cycle and the death rate together, and he published a paper called "Prosperity as a Cause of Death." And it turns out that the death rate, age-adjusted death rate, goes down in the periods of unemployment and recession. And the death rate goes up with prosperity because people, as you said, are working themselves to death, basically. And this is a paper that has been cited and has been confirmed many times. So you think the boom is good for everybody. It's not. It's not good for people's health. So that's one. The other book by Graeber just came out last fall, and I think it's called The Dawn of Everything, or something like The Dawn of Everything, and it's basically a description of saying that the story about human development is that we needed, the larger the groups, we needed more hierarchical control, and we needed these big governments to run us. And basically, he's an anarchist, and he said, no, there's anthropological, there's paleontological, archaeological evidence that people could manage themselves. They didn't need bosses and generals and all this stuff to manage. We can manage our lives. And I certainly see that in Panama. In small communities, people get along. They don't need governors. So
Peter, I think we got some other questions in the room here.
I was just wondering, the gentleman back there asked about Japan, and I taught in Southeast Asia, and I noticed they have low rates of obesity comparatively, but higher suicide rates. So I don't know if you could talk to that, and a lot less things in their homes. So kind of overt consumption where people just stuff their homes with things. What's the difference between Japan, a highly industrialized nation, and the U.S.? Because I know they don't have everything that Europe has with maternal leave policies and workers.
They have a lot. Yeah, no. Japan has a lot of this. And the idea that they have high suicide rates, I would like to see the data because I don't think it's true. People used to say, oh, Sweden has socialism, but they have high suicide rates. They don't. They don't.
So it might be faulty.
This is an impression somehow that people have had. Japan does not. Suicide in Japan, has a dramatic role and storied. It can be a very dramatic thing, but the rates are not higher than they're not like they are in the U.S.
Okay, and I just had one more question. It seems kind of like Marxist theories. Well, I guess this is two. My grandma worked the factories in World War II, and my dad, she's a school teacher. She likes using her brain, and she was. And my dad's an engineer. He worked manual labor for years before he became an engineer.
do you think it could be the way that you look at work? Both of them said my grandma memorized Bible verses or kind of like tried to keep their minds active while doing rote, or a lot of my family are farmers, and for me that's boring, repetitive, like milking cows. That's, like boring, repetitive work. But what would you say about like meditation, what Buddhist monks do? Isn't that boring and repetitive? But potentially, can you find fulfillment in work? Like, there's different schools of thought.
Under the right circumstances. I mean, I have a farm now. I work on the farm.
But I guess that's what Adam Smith said. I kind of, do you 100% agree with what he said? It turns you boring and stupid.
Well, if you're just
Rote
doing
work.
this one repetitive
Yep.
function, but a farm, I mean, pruning a tree it's a meditation. I mean, it's a meditative act. You look at the tree, you see how it grows, you see what to remove. It's like Michelangelo, moving the marble chips to reveal the angel inside. That's what I do with the tree.
Okay.
Shoveling manure is a physical labor. It's not really boring. There's all kinds of stuff going on.
Okay.
And if you're milking cows, every cow is different. There's a lot of. I mean,
Well-
I find farm work.
What would you say? I have a girlfriend that's a school teacher, a middle school teacher, and she's thinking of quitting for a couple years to do piece rate at the Elkhart factories because they're paying $1,300 a week, and it's 3 times what she makes as a teacher. So, what would you say to someone? She enjoys teaching to an extent. With No Child Left Behind, there's a lot of, you know what I mean? It's not what it used to be teaching. What would you say to her sister, like, puts stickers on RVs? What would you say to someone who's considering leaving a mentally stimulating job to a job that pays 3 times as much?
I would say don't do it.
Don't do it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what her needs are. I wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And I would also say, in terms of, let me say one thing about Marxism. I was raised as a Marxist, and I would say what I was told, my mother told me, my father told me, year after year, was the following quote from Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, written published in 1848 when Marx was 29. And it goes beyond, the Judeo-Christian tradition of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It says, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And that's how I was raised. And it's a more demanding standard. It means if I have a lot of ability, it's incumbent upon me to use that to help other people who have less ability. And man, if that was a standard that got widely adopted, we'd be in much better shape. I think Marx, in the end, made a mistake in thinking that we would evolve toward this communist state in a natural way because there are laws of history. Well, we're animals. I mean, we evolved. Darwin is the one who got it right. And so we can't expect to evolve into some great, wonderful thing, but we can move there with the attitude of from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, and that's what I stand by that.
So it's 7 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of people's time. We've gone over a bit. I know that we have a bunch of questions, I think, online, but I think we're going to be able to get to them. I want to thank Peter for a really stimulating conversation and some really creative thinking. I don't know whether there's any of you here that are thinking about going to medical school, but I think earlier today he advised anybody who's thinking about going to medical school to read his book before you go so you can bring some tough questions to your professors at medical school before you get there. And you're not necessarily going to buy into the same curriculum they've been teaching for 40 years, I think is the way he put it earlier in the day. I want to thank our colleagues at the Clow Institute here at the Keough School, as well as our friends and colleagues at the Neuroscience and Behavioral Sciences program here on campus for joining with us and bringing Peter here. So if you'll just join me in thanking Peter and for a great session.
Well, thank you all for coming and sticking picking it out here. This is,
And this is the book.
Yeah.
And I think there's some that were available outside for a very reasonable price.